Torchlight flickers against mud brick walls as a procession moves slowly through the alleys of Babylon, the largest city the ancient world had ever known. The Euphrates whispers nearby, thick with reeds and secrets. Above them, ziggurats pierce, the purple dusk like altars to forgotten gods. The men walk barefoot, head shaven, robes coarse and colorless. They do not speak. In the heart of the procession are the boys. They are not criminals, not slaves, not warriors. They are sons of merchants, scribes, bakers' boys born into the wrong age with bodies untouched by women. To the crowd, they are holy. To the priests, they are useful. But beneath the incense, beneath the chants and oil and smoke, is the trembling truth. They are fuel, bound by ritual, stripped of choice. They will be made to offer what no boy should: purity. To a God who cannot answer, pain to a system that cannot feel. No temple carvings show their faces. No tablets record their names. But their blood once ran down temple steps, offered to Marduk, Ishtar, and 1,000 demons carved in clay. Today, we strip away the legend of ancient piety and grandeur. We descend into the cold machinery of sacred violence, the ritual sacrifice not of lambs or oxen, but of innocence itself. The sky over Babylon did not smile. It glared, wide, flat, and blinding. Beneath it, the city sprawled in symmetry, its walls breathing heat, its ziggurats like stone staircases to nowhere. The wind carried the stench of burnt myrrh, sun-warmed. Brick and something older, more bitter, the scent of ancient promises sealed in blood. This was not a world built on grace. The gods of Babylon were not kind. They did not forgive. They did not love. They wanted endlessly, violently. Desire was the breath of divinity, and men existed only to feed it. At the center stood Marduk, king of gods, who did not ascend but was chosen, not by spirit, but by empire. Once he had been a minor god of storms. Now he had 50 names, each etched into temple stone like tiles on a tomb. With each name he grew hungrier. The people bowed, not in devotion, but in debt. Every prayer was a transaction, every festival a negotiation, and every body a potential price. The priests, draped in white linen stiff with dried oil, spoke of balance, of offering what is pure, so the gods would not punish the impure. But the purity they sought was not metaphor. It had to bleed. The untouched male, skin unbruised by labor, lips unsullied by women, became the coin with which the city bought peace. His body, a cipher for civic salvation. His pain, a substitute for collective guilt. He was not chosen for his strength, but for his emptiness. He had done nothing, and that made him worthy. Some said the gods spoke through fire, others through dreams. But Marduk's voice came through absence, the crops that failed, the child who withered, the river that swallowed instead of feeding. The answer was always the same: offer more. And so a theology formed not around faith, but fear. The god would be sated, or the people would burn. In the temple's inner sanctum, where no woman walked and no echo dared return, the boys were offered. Not as individuals, not as names, but as essence, symbols of untouched flesh. Their innocence became Babylon's shield. Their bodies, invisible scaffolding for imperial pride. None asked if the god wanted them, only if he would be angry if. They withheld, the god never appeared. His statues stared blankly, lips frozen mid-command. But still the offerings came, and in this silence, a new horror was born. Not the horror of divine wrath, but the cold, obedient march of men who believed in its possibility. It is one thing to die by fire. It is another to be told your death is sacred and necessary, and that your silence is the most faithful prayer. In Babylon, the gods did not demand love. They demanded obedience, and they demanded men. The boy would not run. He would be wrapped in white, kissed by smoke, and led inward, toward the dark mouth of the altar where gods never spoke, but always received. The stone beneath his feet had felt this weight before, and it would feel it again. He was never told why, only that the priest had looked just once into the bowl of blackened water, and nodded. The boy's mother had already begun to wail. His father said nothing. The silence clung to the room like smoke that would not lift. That night, he was not allowed to sleep in his bed. He was taken to a stone chamber near the eastern wall, where no fire was lit, and told that the gods had seen something in him, something unspoiled. The word was spoken softly, almost reverently. Virgin. He did not know what it meant, but the way they said it felt like a sentence. They searched for it, always across the city, in homes poor and rich. They looked for boys who did not yet carry the stain of longing, boys who had not touched nor been touched, who still flinched when the wind turned suddenly cold, who still cried at night and wiped their tears before anyone could see. They came cloaked in incense and ritual, but beneath the silk they were hunters. And what they hunted was absence. Virginity was not something a boy chose. It was something taken from him, not through touch, but through gaze, through selection. A flick of the priest's hand, a reading of stars, a birthmark behind the knee, a dream dreamt by someone else. Once chosen, the boy no longer belonged to himself. He belonged to the god. They shaved his head, not as punishment, but as purification. The hair was burned in a clay bowl with cedar leaves and goat's blood. The smoke was meant to carry his impurity away. He watched it curl toward the sky, but it didn't feel like release. It felt like loss. They dressed him in linen so coarse it scraped his skin raw. They tied a red cord around his wrist, a symbol of his binding. He was forbidden from speaking his own name. It was considered too impure now, too earthly. He would answer only to what the priests called him, Markadu, the marked one. At night, he lay on straw and listened to the others breathe. Some whispered prayers. Others whispered nothing at all. One boy bit his own palm until it bled. He said it was to remember he was real. They were told to fast, to scrub their bodies with salt, to chant verses that made no sense. They were told the gods did not love them. The gods needed them. He wanted to ask when he would go home, but he already knew the answer. Virginity had never been about purity. It was about power, the power to erase. To take a boy who had yet to understand his own body and use that very unknowing as a vessel. To say, you are clean because you are untouched, and you are holy because you are silent. It was a strange kind of defilement, one without hands. One that did not break skin, but hollowed from the inside. They did not violate the body. They stole it, piece by invisible piece, and still he obeyed. He fasted. He prayed. He whispered the hymns in a tongue not his own. Because if he obeyed perfectly, he told himself, the god might change his mind, but the god never did, and so he remained untouched, unkissed, unseen by the world that had once called him son. The red cord at his wrist faded with time, but the skin beneath it remained raw. He rubbed it when he was afraid. He rubbed it when he forgot the shape of his mother's face. The priests called it a mark of honor, a divine selection, but the boys knew better. It was not a crown, it was a leash, and once it closed around her throat, it never loosened. At first, it was only silence, a silence too perfect to be natural. No footfalls, no birds, no laughter seeping in from the courtyards. The temple compound swallowed sound like a throat. The boy entered barefoot, his steps hesitant, the stone, cold beneath his skin even in the burning season. He was told not to look back, not at the gate, not at the priest who led him, not at the sky, They called it cleansing. But what they cleansed was not dirt. It was memory. Water came first frigid, metallic, poured in buckets that shocked the breath from his lungs. His robe was stripped away. His body rubbed raw with salted ash until his skin prickled and burned. They spoke to him only in ritual. Tongue, words too old for comfort. One by one, they removed the pieces of him that had lived outside the temple walls. His name, his mother's voice, the rhythm of his sleep, his favorite food, all of it carved away with careful, ceremonial cruelty. Then came the stillness. Days passed inside blank stone rooms with no windows and low ceilings. Oil lamps smoked, thickly in corners, smearing soot over walls already darkened by years of breath and fear. The boys were not allowed to speak, not even to themselves. When they forgot this rule, they were struck not to injure, only to remind. Pain was not punishment. Pain was instruction. In this place, obedience did not come through chains. It came through ritual. Ritual that erased the self. Every morning began the same. The cold cloth, the incense that burned their eyes, the whispered chant before the first meal, bread dry enough to choke on, water that tasted of iron and mold. The priests said it was sacred, but it felt like swallowing stones. They were taught the sacred hymns chants in a language older than their own bones, written in wedge marks none of them could read. The melodies bent in ways that did not comfort, but haunted. Each syllable felt like an intrusion. Each line an intrusion into a mind not yet formed, but already fracturing. When they stumbled, the priests corrected them with silence, not scorn. And somehow that was worse. The absence of anger meant their failure was not emotional, but mechanical. They were instruments, not children. One boy barely older than 10 forgot a line and bit his own tongue out of shame. The others said nothing. They had learned already. Grief is dangerous. Grief suggests something was once whole, and none of them were whole anymore. They were told their suffering held meaning, that the city thrived because of their pain, that each hour of hunger, each sleepless night, each bloody scrape from kneeling, too long on the stone floor, was not cruelty but offering. The gods watched, and the gods remembered. If they broke, if they refused, if they faltered, they endangered everyone. The crops, the river, the king's breath, even their families. Especially their families, so they began to fold themselves inward. They learned not to hope, not to long. They became still, not with peace, but with survival. Sometimes they were allowed to sit by the inner garden, a patch of reeds and stagnant water, overrun with biting flies. It was here the priests whispered to them of purity, of the burden of being chosen, of how no one else could carry what they carried. It was flattery, twisted into a leash. And slowly, the boys believed it. They began to see themselves not as victims, but as vessels. Holy, necessary, expendable, and when a new boy was brought in, frightened, trembling, red-eyed, they did not comfort him. They envied him, because he still had something left to lose. At night, they were not allowed to dream, but they did. In fragments, dreams of light, of their names being called, of warmth, and then always the temple doors closing behind them again. The scent of cedar smoke clung to their hair, to their skin, to the hollow of their chests. Even after the lamps were snuffed, it remained, a kind of second breath, heavy, suffocating. They were not told when the final day would come, only that when it did, they would be clean enough, empty enough, obedient enough. Ready for what? They did not know, but they felt it. In their bones, in their breath, whatever. Waited beyond that final door, it would not return them, not their bodies, not their voices, not even their echoes. The air was thicker that night. It clung to the skin like sweat, but carried no warmth. Even the stars looked different, dimmed, like they were trying not to see. A wind moved across the outer courtyards, but stopped short at the temple gates. As if unwilling to enter, inside the lamps had been doused. Only braziers remained, their coals smoldering, sending up thin tendrils of smoke laced with crushed cedar and burned feathers. The scent did not soothe. It intruded. The boys were not. Called by name, they had none left. They were summoned by number or by silence. One by one, they were led into the lower chambers, barefoot, eyes downcast, their linen robes already damp with sweat from hours of stillness. No words were spoken. There was no instruction. They had been prepared for this. The ritual was not announced with trumpets or prayer. It arrived like illness, slow, invisible, irreversible. In the deepest sanctum, the walls were covered in ash. Charcoal lines formed symbols older than language. They twisted like vines or veins, wrapping the stone in purpose the boys could not read. But they felt it, in the marrow. In the breath they could not catch. The priests wore gloves dyed in goats. Blood, not fresh stiffened from earlier rites. Their hands did not tremble. They moved with the practiced grace of men who had done this many times and long ago ceased calling it what it was. The first offering was a lamb, throat opened over an obsidian basin. Its legs kicked once, then twice, then stopped. Its blood steamed against the stone, and the priests dipped strips of cloth into it, then turned to the boy beside them. He did not run. The cloth was wrapped around his forehead, tight enough to sting, marking him as consecrated. Then they began the recitations. Akkadian verses flowed like oil dents, repetitive, hypnotic. They spoke of binding and undoing, of purity made flesh, of gods who wept when men refused to suffer. The words were carved into the boys' minds. By repetition, until sound itself lost meaning, and only submission remained. The boy stood still until the chant fell to silence. Then came the act. Sometimes it was only symbolic. A gesture, a press of the hand, a cutting of the linen robe at the waist, an anointing with oil near the hips. But not always. Some were stripped bare. Some were touched. Some bled. What was metaphor for one became wound for another. There was no pattern, no logic. The cruelty was not in what was done, but in not knowing what would be. One boy, trembling, fell to his knees before it began. He whispered a prayer to his mother's gods, not realizing they had no place here. They dragged him upright and pressed a warm blade to his collarbone, not to pierce, but to remind. He would carry that mark into the fire. For some, the ritual ended in darkness. Others were led to yet deeper chambers where no witness remained. There, some vanished. Their robes were returned, but not their bodies. The priests said they had ascended, but the stains on the linen told another story. The line between the sacred and the obscene dissolved with purpose. What they did could not be named, so it was called holy. What the boys endured could not be admitted, so it was sung. There was a brazier in each chamber. Smoke rose perpetually from it, mixing with the scent of blood, oil, and something else, something sour and unnameable. When it grew too thick to breathe, they were told it was the gods drawing close. And still, the boys stood, not because they wanted to, but because they no longer knew how to leave, one by one. The virgins disappeared behind stone doors and did not return. Those who remained were forced to chant over the fire, each name stripped from the air like a leaf pulled from a tree. They were told not to cry. To cry was selfish. To cry was impure, but they cried anyway, quietly, so the gods would not hear. When the night finally broke, it did so with no sunrise, only a pale sky and the shriek of crows circling overhead. And somewhere, beneath the earth, the stones remained, warm with what had been offered. The silence afterward was not peace, it was absence, an absence too complete to ever be healed. The stones outside the temple steps were worn smooth, not by feet, but by knees. The mothers came in silence. They were not summoned, not permitted, not acknowledged. They arrived before dawn, before the scent of roasted barley filled the streets, before the market drums began. They waited with veils pulled low, clutching torn satchels and prayers written on clay too soft to last. Their sons were inside, and they were not allowed to see them. Some brought offerings, figs bruised by travel, oil in cracked jars, faded wool dolls once held by smaller hands. None were accepted. The temple guards looked through them, as though grief were a fog and not a face. The sun climbed high. The women remained. The shadows stretched. Still, they stayed. Some whispered into the cracks of the stone walls, convinced the boys could hear them through earth and clay. Some pressed their palms to the bronze gates, lips moving with desperate softness. Others screamed, at the priests, at the gods, at the sky itself, but no voice reached beyond those walls. One woman tore her braids from her scalp, strand by strand, until blood ran down her neck. Another knelt in the dust and struck her chest until ribs cracked. They had not been told their sons were dying. They had been told they were ascending, chosen, set apart. But every mother knows when her child is being taken. In the outer shrine, where lay people were forbidden, there were tablets, hidden behind reed mats and oil lamps, scratched with trembling hands. They held curses, not prayers, curses that named the gods as liars, that begged for blindness to fall upon the high priests, that asked the river to rise and wash it all away. One was smeared with tears so thick the ink bled into itself. It read only, "He was laughing the last time. He was laughing." The temple scribes destroyed most of these, but some survived buried, beneath broken tiles, pressed between bricks, sealed in oil jars, as though grief could ferment into vengeance. The priests never spoke of them. They said the gods had no need for women's sorrow, but the walls remembered even after centuries. Fragments of fingernails were found in the mortar. Women had clawed the walls with their bare hands, not to break in, but to leave something, anything, a mark that said, "I was here, and so was he." They were told to be proud, that their sons were closer to heaven than they would ever be. But pride is a cold garment, and it does not stop the womb from aching when a name is never spoken again. By dusk, the women were gone, their offerings left behind, rotting in the heat, the gates still shut, the smoke still rising, and somewhere beyond those stone walls, the last trace of their children was being burned into nothing. Not even a whisper was allowed to escape, not even a mother's name. They wrote everything, the weight of grain hauled from each field, the number of bricks used to line a merchant's canal, the exact portion of silver owed by a widow whose son died in the flood. They carved it into clay with wedge-shaped precision, each mark pressed with reverent care. The world, according to Babylon, was a record, and to be seen was to exist, but the boys were never written down. No tablet bears their names. No column lists their fathers. No ledger acknowledges their absence. Their robes were counted. Their bodies were not. It was not forgetfulness. It was policy. They were never meant to remain in the temple archives, beneath layers of soot and time. Scribes recorded the length of rituals, the proper chants for invoking the god's breath, the animal entrails laid out in sequence. They documented what oils to use, what day the moon must rest upon, what tone the flute should carry. But the children, those quiet, marked vessels, were absent from all of it. Not once referred to, not once described. It was as though they had never existed at all. Some tablets were broken deliberately, their edges scorched, their lines unreadable. Buried near ash pits, sealed in broken jars, burned with tamarisk and sheep bone. The silence was not accidental. It was carved, A priest once etched a phrase near the edge of an otherwise blank tablet. To speak of the offering is to undo the blessing. That was their law, and so the boys were silenced in both voice and memory. Not only sacrificed, but erased. Not only forgotten, but forbidden. It was a different kind of killing. Those who passed through the fire did not leave shadows. They were scrubbed from the breath of the city, their beds replaced, their bowls washed and given to others. Their names, left unspoken in their mothers' mouths until even mourning became betrayal. No altars bore their likeness. No murals told their story. The gods' silence became theirs. In the dark chambers of the archive rooms, where dust settles like grief and no footstep echoes, the absence is louder than any record. A stillness so complete it feels constructed, crafted like a wall with no door. You do not notice what is missing until you begin to search for it. And when you do, the gap swallows you whole. What is the weight of a name never written? What memory survives when even clay refuses to hold it? The answer is only this: ash, ash in the joints of bricks. Ash in the folds of old linen. Ash in the breath of mothers who can no longer speak. The city remembered everything except them, and, in doing so, made sure they would never return, not even in rumor, not even in stone. The first sound was not fire, it was metal. Bronze blades striking temple gates, not to enter in reverence, but to tear. The Persians came not with prayers, but with declarations. What the Babylonians had lifted to the heavens in ziggurats and chants, they brought crashing down with loss. Statues of Marduk were unseated. Priests were stripped of their robes, their scrolls seized, their chants forbidden. The gods who had demanded obedience for centuries found no voice in the mouths of their conquerors. The holy chambers were emptied, the altars cracked, the braziers went cold. But silence did not mean mercy. No child was brought home. No mothers were reunited with ash. No public mourning permitted. What ended was not the pain, but the theater, and even that only partially. Some temples were converted. Some rituals quietly reborn beneath new names. A god of sky became a god of wisdom. A rite of blood became a rite of light. The priests adapted. They always had. New rulers brought new languages, Persian, then Greek, then Latin. Each one wrapped the past in its own script. Each one claimed to understand Babylon, but none of them spoke of the boys. None unearthed their absence. The ruins were admired, the carvings deciphered, but the voices behind the stone remained buried. The records that were burned were not the most dangerous. It was the ones that survived, the ones that spoke only of glory, of divine architecture, of golden lions and great processions. They told of civilization, not sacrifice. Power, not pain. Tourists came. Scholars followed. All marveled at the symmetry. No one asked who had bled between those stones. By the time the Romans arrived, the temples had become relics. The fire pits were dry, the chants forgotten. But the shape of the chambers remained, like a scar long. After the wound has closed, some say the Persians ended the cruelty. Others say they merely replaced it with their own. There was no reckoning, only repurposing. The walls did not speak. The gods did not fall. They were renamed. History, too, began to shift. The word sacrifice softened. It became metaphor. The boys became myth, and myth is a kind of grave. No markers, no mourning, just a beautiful story no one dares open. The temples fell, but nothing was freed, only covered, only redrawn, only quieted. And in that quiet, the boys remained unfound, not resting, just waiting. There are no more temples, no more stone altars slick with oil, no chants rising in dust-choked chambers. The ziggurats have collapsed into memory, and the names of gods once whispered in trembling awe now lie buried beneath sand and scholarship. But The silence remains. It lingers not in ruins, but in bedrooms, courtrooms, barracks, cells. In the quiet corners where boys are still told that pain makes them men. Where silence is still praised and tenderness still punished, the word has changed. Virgin, but the weight of it has not. It is not spoken with reverence now. It is spoken with ridicule, a stain, not a sanctity. Something to be scrubbed out of boys through humiliation or force. Not to elevate, but to erase. The shame has shifted shape, but it has not loosened its grip. They are no longer offered to gods, but they are still offered to war, to hunger, to rage passed down like a sickness, to creeds that promise purity and reward violence, to rites of manhood carved not with scripture, but with fists, to loneliness, to laughter that cuts like rope. They are marked differently now, not with cords of red or ash on the forehead, but you can still see it in the slouched shoulders, in the downward glance, in the voices that crack and vanish altogether. The ones who never learned how to be anything but empty, taught that their body was either a weapon or a failure. Nothing in between. Some disappear slowly, beneath silence, beneath shame, beneath rituals no one calls rituals. Others vanish quickly, swallowed by institutions that still use words like correction or honor, and still we do not write their names. Still we offer no hymns, still we turn away. What was once a sacred transaction is now a forgotten echo. But echoes carry. They bleed through the stone. They hum beneath laughter. They pass between fathers and sons like old scars. No fire burns on the altar anymore. But the altar is still here. It has changed its shape. It speaks a new language, but it remembers, and somewhere, deep beneath the centuries, beneath the collapsed temples and eroded stone, beneath the smoke and salt and forgotten prayers, there are boys who never returned. We do not know their names, but we know their silence. And it sounds too much like our own.